Picture this. You're standing in a swamp in East Africa. The air is thick. The water is green and still. And somewhere in the reeds ahead of you, something is watching. It has not moved in over an hour, not a twitch, not a blink. You would swear it was a statue until its eyes shift just slightly, tracking something beneath the surface. Then, without warning, 5 feet of prehistoric muscle and bone collapses forward in less than a fifth of a second. There is a splash, a crunch, and when the water settles, a 6-foot-long lungfish is missing its head. This is not a dinosaur. It is not some cryptid from a campfire story. It is a real living bird, and for over 100 years, the scientists who studied it could not even agree on what it actually was. They called it strange. They called it a mistake of nature. Some of them, quite literally, argued about it in print for decades. And it turns out almost everything they assumed about this bird was wrong. Its name is the shoebill. And if you have never heard of it, that is not an accident. This is one of the least understood birds on Earth, hiding in some of the most remote wetlands on the planet. And what researchers have slowly uncovered about it is stranger, darker, and far more fascinating than the internet's favorite scary bird memes ever let on. So stick with me, because by the end of this, you are going to look at birds completely differently. Let's start with the obvious, the face. If you have seen a photo of a shoebill, you know the one. That flat, gray, almost mechanical looking bill, shaped like an old wooden Dutch clog, hanging beneath a pair of pale yellow eyes that seem to stare directly into your soul. The bill alone can measure close to 9.5 inches long, and it is the third longest bill of any bird alive, trailing only pelicans and a couple of stork species. The bird itself stands 4 to 5 feet tall, with a wingspan that can stretch past 8 feet, wider than most adult humans are tall. And when it looks at you, it does not blink the way you expect. It just stares, motionless for minutes, sometimes for hours. Early European naturalists who encountered this bird in the swamps of the Nile Basin did not know what to do with it. It had the long legs and waiting posture of a stork. It had a hooked, muscular bill unlike anything in the stork family. And it had a strange habit of standing perfectly frozen for impossibly long stretches, which made it look less like a living animal and more like a taxidermied prop somebody had left in the marsh as a joke. For decades, scientists placed it with the storks simply because it looked like one. Case closed, or so they thought. But here's where the story actually gets interesting, because in 1905, a British zoologist named Frank Evers Beddard sat down and admitted in writing that nobody actually knew what this bird was. He said there was no doubt it belonged with either the herons or the storks, but which one, he had no idea. Herons have a specific kind of feather called powder down that crumbles into a fine dust used for preening and waterproofing. Shoebills do not have those feathers in the same way. That single detail was enough to throw the entire classification into chaos. If it was not quite a heron, and it did not quite fit as a stork either, then what on earth was staring back at these researchers from the swamp? The answer did not come from binoculars or field notes. It came over a century later from DNA. When modern genetic testing was finally run on shoebill tissue samples, the results were not a small correction. They were a complete reshuffling of the bird's entire family tree. Scientists discovered that the shoebill is not a stork at all. It never was. Genetically, its closest relatives turn out to be pelicans, along with a small, strange brown bird called the hammerkop, which most people outside of Africa have never even heard of. The shoebill was moved into the order Pelecaniformes, the same broad group as pelicans, herons, and ibises, and given its own private family, Shoebill inhypetidae that it does not share with a single other living species on the planet. Out of every bird alive today, on every continent, in every habitat, this one has no living cousins in its own family. It is, quite literally, one of a kind, a lone branch on the tree of life that has been standing apart for tens of millions of years. And speaking of millions of years, here is a detail that barely gets mentioned outside of ornithology journals. Fossil evidence puts ancestors of this bird's lineage back at least 30 million years into the Eocene epoch, long before humans, long before most of the animals we consider ancient today, back when Africa's climate and geography looked completely different. This is not an animal that evolved recently to fill some modern niche. It is a living leftover from a much older world, one that simply never needed to change its winning formula. Now let's talk about how this bird actually hunts, because this is where the shoebill stops being merely strange and starts being genuinely terrifying. Unlike most wading birds that patrol the shallows, constantly moving, poking around for scraps, the shoebill uses a strategy built almost entirely on patience. It picks a spot, often near stagnant, poorly oxygenated pools where fish are forced to surface just to breathe, and it simply stops. It does not pace. It does not shuffle. It stands with its bill pressed down against its neck and waits, sometimes for hours, sometimes appearing so still that researchers observing it in the field genuinely could not tell whether the bird was hunting or asleep. A 2014 study found that on average, a shoebill successfully catches only about one prey item for every 8 hours it spends hunting. Read that again. 8 hours of near total stillness for a single meal. This bird has essentially perfected the art of doing nothing until the exact right moment arrives. And when that moment comes, everything changes in an instant. The shoebill does not gently snap forward like a heron spearing a minnow. Its entire head and neck collapse downward into the water with its full body weight behind the strike, an explosive, almost violent lunge that can end in well under a quarter of a second, faster than most prey has any chance to react to. Sometimes the bird misses its footing entirely and topples forward into the mud. And because of how much force and balance the strike requires, it can take the shoebill several minutes just to stand back up afterward. There is no elegant recovery here. It is all or nothing every single time. What is it actually hunting for? Mostly African lungfish, ancient air-breathing fish that can grow up to 6 feet long, along with catfish, tilapia, eels, and water snakes. But here's the detail that tends to shock people who assume this is just an oversized heron. Shoebills have been documented killing and eating baby crocodiles. Juvenile Nile, crocodiles, hatchlings, and yearlings small enough to fit inside that enormous bill are absolutely on the menu. The bill itself is not just big, it is a weapon. Its edges are sharp enough to slice cleanly through tough fish bone and crocodile hide, and shoebills will frequently use the hook tip to decapitate their prey outright before swallowing, a habit that actually serves a very practical purpose. It keeps sharp fins, spines, and claws from tearing up the bird's throat on the way down. This is not random savagery. It is precision engineering, refined over millions of years, wrapped in a package that looks like oversized footwear. There's another detail about its flight that almost never comes up. A shoebill's wing beat is astonishingly slow, roughly 150 flaps per minute, among the slowest wing beat rates of any bird on Earth. Combine that with the wingspan pushing past 8 feet, and watching one take off in person is often described as less like a bird flying and more like something enormous and ancient reluctantly deciding to leave the ground. It typically flies with its neck folded back against its body, the same way herons do, rather than stretched out like a stork, which was actually one of the small clues researchers used to start questioning that original stork classification in the first place. And the sound this bird makes when it is not hunting is somehow just as unsettling. Around the nest, or when greeting its mate, a shoebill will rapidly clatter the two halves of its enormous bill together, producing a sound that has been compared more than once to a machine gun going off in the reeds. For a bird that spends most of its life in near total silence, that sudden burst of rattling noise echoing across an empty swamp is enough to make even seasoned wildlife guides jump. Now, here's a fact that almost nobody outside of Africa knows, and it is one of the strangest physiological tricks in the entire bird world. When a shoebill gets too hot standing out in the equatorial sun, it does not pant, and it does not seek shade the way you might expect. It defecates directly onto its own legs. This is called urohydrosis, and while it sounds disgusting, and honestly it is, the science behind it is genuinely clever. Because the waste is mostly liquid, it evaporates off the legs, and that evaporation pulls heat away from the blood vessels, running just beneath the skin, cooling the bird down the same way sweat cools you. So the next time you complain about a hot day, remember, at least you do not have to cool yourself down with your own droppings. There is also a courtship side to this bird that almost contradicts everything you have heard so far. Shoebills spend the vast majority of their lives in near total silence, avoiding contact, avoiding attention, avoiding even other shoebills. But during courtship, the two birds face each other and bow, repeatedly dipping their massive heads low while clattering their bills and letting out a strange, high-pitched whining sound, almost like a mechanical hinge that badly needs oil. For a species this solitary and this intimidating, watching two of them awkwardly bowing to one another in a swamp is oddly one of the most humanizing things you can witness in the natural world. Let's move to parenting, because this is where the shoebill goes from fascinating to genuinely dark, and it is not something you see highlighted in most cute animal documentaries. Shoebill pairs typically lay 2 eggs, occasionally 3, roughly 5 days apart. Both parents share incubation duties. And here's a small detail people love once they hear it. On especially hot days, the parents will scoop water into that giant bill and pour it directly over the eggs to keep them cool, sometimes doing this 4 or 5 times a day. It looks, and honestly is, remarkably tender for an animal this intimidating. But once the chicks hatch, something much colder begins. Almost every single time, only one chick from the clutch survives to leave the nest. The older, stronger sibling will attack the younger one repeatedly, pecking and battering it, often over the course of several days, while the parents largely stand by. In some documented cases, researchers have observed parents showing a subtle preference toward the stronger chick, even appearing to withhold water from the weaker one during periods of extreme heat. It is not that the parents are cruel by nature. It is closer to a brutal insurance policy, evolved over an unforgiving environment where resources are scarce, food is hard to find, and investing everything into one strong survivor gives the species a better shot than trying, and likely failing, to raise 2 weak ones. Compare that to a distant relative like the great blue heron, common across North America, which lays several eggs and nests in large protected colonies where chicks have real backup and support. The shoebill has no such safety net. It nests completely alone, defends a solitary territory that can stretch across roughly 3 square kilometers, and lives, hunts, and even raises its young almost entirely in isolation. Even mated pairs, once breeding season ends, will separate and go back to living, eating, and hunting hunting completely alone. This solitary, brutal efficiency is a huge part of why the species remains so rare. Current estimates put the global population somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 mature individuals, depending on the survey, and the shoebill is currently classified as vulnerable by the IUCN. The greatest threats are not natural predators. They are wetland destruction, agricultural expansion into papyrus swamps, human disturbance near nesting sites, and, disturbingly, illegal capture for the exotic pet and wildlife trade, where a single live shoebill can fetch a devastating price on the black market. And here's something most people never think to ask. Where would you actually go to see one of these in the wild? There's no easy answer because shoebills are famously difficult to spot, scattered thinly across remote, often inaccessible swamps in South Sudan, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and a handful of other countries across East and Central Africa. But there is one location that has become something of a pilgrimage site for birdwatchers worldwide, the Mabamba Swamp in Uganda, barely an hour from Entebbe International Airport. Local guides there have gotten so skilled at tracking individual resident birds that sighting success rates reportedly exceed 80%, an almost unheard of number for a species this elusive and this rare. In captivity, shoebills have also proven to be remarkably long-lived, with some individuals in zoos reaching well past 30 years of age, and there are unverified but widely repeated reports of captive birds living even longer, decades beyond what most wading birds ever achieve in the wild. Here is one more piece almost nobody outside East Africa knows. This bird has actually been part of human culture for thousands of years. Depictions believed to represent the shoebill appear in ancient Egyptian artwork, and Arab traders who encountered the species centuries ago reportedly gave it the name Abu Markub, which translates roughly to father of a shoe or one with a shoe. Long before modern science had any idea where to place this bird on the family tree, the people who actually lived alongside it had already given it a name that nailed the single most distinctive thing about it. There is one final scientific wrinkle worth knowing, because it explains why this bird stays so rare even in places where its swamps are protected. Because shoebills nest alone, defend such enormous territories, and only reliably fledge a single chick per breeding attempt, their population simply cannot bounce back quickly, even under ideal conditions. Researchers studying the species have raised concerns about low genetic diversity across scattered, disconnected wetland populations, the kind of slow-motion vulnerability that does not make headlines the way poaching does, but can be just as dangerous for a species' long-term survival. It is a sobering reminder that an animal can look utterly indestructible, built like something out of the Cretaceous, and still be one bad decade away from serious trouble. So let's bring this back around. For most of modern scientific history, the shoebill was treated as a slightly awkward stork, a strange-looking cousin nobody quite knew what to do with, filed away under the wrong heading, simply because it stood on long legs in shallow water and had a beak. Nobody suspected that underneath that misclassification was a genetic outlier unlike anything else alive, a solitary hunter capable of killing baby crocodiles in a fifth of a second, a bird whose lineage stretches back 30 million years, cooling itself with its own waste, and making some of the most brutal parenting decisions in the entire animal kingdom, all while standing so still that people genuinely could not tell if it was alive. Scientists thought the shoebill was just a strange bird. They were wrong. It is not strange. It is something far rarer than that. It is one of the last living reminders that evolution does not always produce something familiar, dressed up in a slightly different color. Sometimes it produces something that has no real category at all, something that simply exists on its own terms, alone in a swamp, waiting exactly as it has for millions of years for the next unlucky fish to come up for air. If a bird this strange, this ancient, and this misunderstood managed to hide in plain sight for over a century of modern science, it makes you wonder what else out there is still waiting to be correctly understood. Thanks for watching, and if this blew your mind even a little, you already know what to do. Stick around because there are far stranger animals than this one still to come.